think we're still sharing, aren't we? Can you still see my slides? Yeah, okay, that's good. Okay, so the last one is about data and information. So it is a really broad brushed approach, this is, to project management, but it looks at a number of different issues, and I think, you know, hopefully it's quite relatable to your the situations we've spoken about. So here we're looking at good practices in terms of managing data and information for our particular project. So part of that might be about how we plan our communications, because we're actually choosing which data and information that we're going to share with different parties. So we might create a communication plan with this, or a communication strategy, and we definitely talked about this as well with stakeholders and how we're going to do an engagement plan or a comms plan. But actually, before we even do that, what's the difference? Actually, let's just leave it on there for a sec so I can ask you, what's the difference between data and information?
Data, remember this, I'm not going to remember it properly now, but information is more useful. So data is kind of raw, uninterpreted, whereas information has kind of been filtered to make more sense, and then knowledge is actually where it's understood and engaged.
Yeah, fantastic. So we're going to get data potentially is the raw sort of what goes into the computer systems, and the information is then put contextualized, really, isn't it, in order to make some decisions. So data can almost, at its purest form, it's almost like ones and zeros. It's like, it's almost binary. That's what data is. It's but it means nothing unless we then putting it into some sort of context, which we can then use as information to inform decisions. We've got to make sure that the data that's collected is helpful, really, and it's not biased, and it's an accurate sample size. Do you know what the difference is between primary and secondary data, anyone? A couple of you have done degrees. Chloe, you've done a degree, haven't you?
Yes. So primary data is kind of like what Claire said, the raw data. So you might collect it from like a primary source. So if you're, I don't know, doing consultations with nearby residents, or like GI borehole data, and then secondary data is, you know, when you've processed it a bit, and that's how you're going to relay it and actually use it. Is that right?
But you asked me with a question, didn't you, in your voice there? Yeah. We'll go back to it. I'm going to I'm going to ask you the second one now, the second one down. Any ideas what those two are?
Oh yeah, qualitative is kind of descriptive, and then quantitative you can use, you know, like graphically numerical.
Are you, what was it? Was it engineering?
Yeah.
What did you do? Yeah, that makes sense. Why you know. Yeah, okay. And actually, how well you said those really well, because I think they're horrible words to say, aren't they? So I'm really glad you said that. Quantitative. Oh my gosh, sounds like you've got, not sounds like you've got, but it's quite difficult to say. Quantitative, quantities, numbers. So it's sort of, it's easy to use, isn't it, Chloe? So in terms of, if you were collecting data, which would you prefer to have, numbers or opinions, if you were processing it then?
I find quantitative easier to evaluate.
Yeah, because you can be processed, you can put it in an Excel spreadsheet, can't you? And the qualitative is sort of like, it isn't really quality because they're both quality, but qualitative is where we've got our insights, what people are thinking, what the people are feeling. But the challenge we've got is if we're always going for numbers which are easier to interpret, we sometimes don't get the why. We don't get what's going wrong. We don't really understand the nature of the problem, because we're straight into collecting data which is more easily processed, but we can sometimes be investigating the wrong thing. So I'm going to go back to primary and secondary. Primary and secondary are entirely misleading, okay, because primary sounds like it comes first because you go to primary school and then you go to secondary school. However, in the context of data, this is the distinction between the two. Secondary data is data that's already being collected. So you might have, let's have a think, if you're starting a project you may even have some information from a previous project that was done in the same area, and it may be a year old or something, but actually you've got some information about the number of inhabitants, the number of a particular geography, or the number of road users on a sort of certain thing. But it's basically, it's not collected for your particular project. It's already collected. It could be some government statistics that you've got. It could be from the Office of National Statistics, but it's already sorted. So the idea with secondary data, and the reason we'd use it first, which is why I'm saying it's confusing, is because it should be easily accessible. Sometimes we have to pay for it. So sometimes if it's really technical data, there is, like, you almost have to subscribe or pay for research papers, but it's there, and actually we don't have to go out and look for it. And then I think, Chloe, when you were giving your examples, you did mention about primary data being something that you were collecting yourself. You did give something about sort of like almost like we have to search for it ourselves. And the primary data, this is the different distinction between the two. Primary data is something that's done specifically for the purpose of a project. So your secondary data, if you're looking at a particular project in a certain area, we're looking at what demographic information already exists about that particular geography. Then we might have to do some public consultations to find out around our projects, around our publics, what are they thinking? That consultation would be primary data. So see what I mean? It's secondary first, we're getting the context, then it's primary. And then within that, we've got the option of getting opinions, which again would be qualitative. So this is like if you've got you're doing your public consultation, it's you can try and get opinions, sometimes give them a number, so you can say, you know, how happy are you from 0 to 10 of something happening? And you know, you've probably seen it in the NHS, haven't you, where you sort of, you have some treatment and you've got the sort of happy sheet with an unhappy face to a happy face. And the reason they do that, it's called a Likert scale, and you do that because you can quantify it quite easily. So they can then do a chart, you know, the average rating is X. So what they're trying to do is make an opinion a number because it's easier to analyse. Does that all make sense? What we need to do is we need to be thinking about this in light of our project. So we're thinking about how we are managing data and information within our project or for our project. So we may then be communicating with people, but we need to capture it first, and we need to know what to share with them. So we've got the opinions, the what's, the why's, the how's. So where would you need to know that in your project? So these aren't the numbers. How would this inform your project? Can you give me some examples, anyone?
For us, it will inform how we design the service. So it's quite, like you say, opinionated, and it's what can we do to make it better? Why does it make it better, and how do we make it better?
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So we're not starting off with an answer, we're actually exploring, aren't we?
Agile, one might say, rather than waterfall.
And we're going to come on to that in the next session. Very good. Okay. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So we're sort of listening. That's it. So, and then the numbers, what sort of numbers? So how much is going to be budget potentially, isn't it? But then could it be around like the usage potentially, the how much, how likely, how quickly, that sort of thing? Where on your projects, where do you need to know?
I use this quite a lot, so I would generally use the qualitative data as my problem statement. So what is the problem? Why is it a problem? How is it a problem? And then use the quantitative as my kind of backup data to say, okay, this is how much it's costing us as a baseline. This is how many times it's happening. How is it only happening on day shift or night shift and specific people? And drill down into kind of that. You've spoken to somebody, you understand kind of the basic understanding of the problem, and you've got what the problem is, but now you're kind of knuckling down into the actual numbers of, is this big
like
enough?
The evidence, isn't it? And it's almost like you work when you're talking about the working time directive. It was like about So what's the issue? But you're scoping out like how many people does it actually impact, and that then gets you listened to. So it's interesting, isn't it? On its own, qualitative could be seen as quite weak because we need evidence to back it up that actually the scale of the problem. So this is why it's quite useful to have both together. Okay, so I mentioned primary would be your team, or it's sort of, or you may even get a research organisation to do it on your behalf if it's felt that there'd be a level of bias, or you haven't got the level of skills in your team to collect the data for you. What could be challenges around using data that's already been gathered? What's the possible problem with it?
Reliability. You don't know what standards the data has been collected to. You might not know how old it is. Specs might have changed, and
perfect.
Yeah,
and the agenda, we don't even know. Like, depending on who commissioned it. So I did my MBA at Durham, and Durham University were commissioned by Coca-Cola to do some research for them, and the results weren't what they wanted. So Coca-Cola asked them to basically change the results, and Durham were like, no, you paid for this, and actually we've got our brand as well, and we're seen as a credible brand. We can't be like, don't lie. But you sort of, if you've got data that's commissioned by AstraZeneca or some sort of pharmaceutical organisation, and then it's sort of talking about some treatment in a particular field, you need to be a little bit mindful, don't you, as to like what the agenda is in terms of even I think about sort of this. We say a shampoo adverts, and they say something like 88% of 63 women asked, or it's like beauty products, isn't it? And it's such small samples. But yeah, so we just need to be, actually, one thing that's been really good, it's the Advertising Standards Authority. Now, in terms of use of data and publication of data, there are standards in terms of having to actually talk about the scope of the sources. So in terms of like actual numbers, because it really does diminish the value of certain claims, doesn't it? And it sort of gives a level of transparency. So we need to be really careful with secondary. Just under what guidance was it actually created and gathered? How old it is? What was the sample size? What's different? Because I think now any data that we're collecting, we've got to be sort of pre-pandemic to post. We're potentially talking quite a different landscape, even though in some ways it could still be very recent, but it could still be absolutely out of date now. Because I don't know, like as we've spoken earlier, how many people are actually going to be physically going back to the workplace in the way they did before. I don't think we're talking. It's like experiments, isn't it? And sort of conditions, they're not going to be the same. So I think this is going to mean a lot of secondary data has limited validity. In our current sort of situation. So we've got data which has been gathered, but actually doesn't mean anything yet until we apply it, and information is where we've processed it, so it actually is fit for our purpose. We've got some criteria here. So if the data is relevant, so it's specifically for, so it might be, do you think the regions of the country do you think attitudes are quite different? So if we were looking at some data for a project that was gathered, Paul, in your area, as opposed to London, do you think there's going to be different? The demographic is going to mean it's quite different, wouldn't they, with people's perceptions? I would have thought. Do you?
Yeah, possibly. Yeah.
It's just a different pace and different, sort of pressures and the different expectations, isn't it? So actually, it might not be, even if it was gathered for a similar type of project, I think we can't transfer it and think it's still going to be relevant. Potentially, I don't know. Yeah, so I just think we need to be a little bit, because there is a risk if we're not careful, we try and reuse stuff that actually doesn't give us the sense that we need to get. If you're talking about current data, how up to date does it? Do you know, for the HS2 project, how was their data? Was there sort of attitude surveys, or was there do you know what's been gathered?
There was a lot of data gathered before we came to site. I don't have a complete overview. I'm aware of like ground investigation works that will obviously aid the actual engineering of the design. I'm assuming there was consultation with all landowners, because obviously we had to take people's houses and farms away from them. So there would have been that data to try and find the best route that had the least impact.
Yeah.
Just trying to think of other data, like flood mapping as well.
Okay, because I mean, in terms of currency, that would probably need to be fairly current, and any sort of audits of the wildlife and things like that, that would have to be fairly current as well, wouldn't it? Because it would be a changing.
Oh yes, that's true. That's actually ongoing. So we're still carrying out ecology surveys, because it depends at the time of year. You can't look for certain species in the winter, or
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a good example. Adequate. I mean, in your case, you can't just do a sample of a small area. You've said sort of in terms of different woodlands and different things, you know, that you're going to get different. So your coverage area is going to be very, very high. You know, for other people, it might be a smaller sample that you need to do. So actually, what I'm getting at is all of these, it's very project dependent. And actually, in terms of timely, we've got to make sure we've got enough data, but is it, you know, how long is it taking us to get? How expensive it is to get? What's the quality? You know, it's the triangle again. But actually, we need to make sure that we can use it, but we've got enough to use. So it's sort of working out what that looks like. In terms of who would compile the data as well, I suppose it's if you outsource it, is that an organisation that has a profile in that field, which, you know, you'd look for certain qualifications or certain accreditations. I think for the wildlife, Chloe, is that kept internal, or is there a sort of an agency or whatever that do that auditing? Do you know?
We do have ecologists employed directly for the project, so they're carrying out the ones I've liaised with. They're carrying out the site walkovers themselves. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So they're, you know, we've got quite a high level of confidence in terms of their reliability, and actually that will be quite a cost-effective way of doing it, because if you've got in-house ecologists, then actually we should be getting the right quality information versus sort of keeping the costs manageable in the sense of not outsourcing it and potentially having a huge cost bill. So we've got the cost and control there. But I like those criteria. I think they're quite useful, because if we're not careful, we can just be given facts or figures, but if we don't ask the right questions, we haven't got the right context behind them to sort of really challenge, are they useful? And actually, particularly Claire Gibbons, you were talking about, you've mentioned a few times about using information from previous projects as a starting point. This is almost worth, actually, if you've got some useful insights, doing a bit of an audit as to actually, is it these things? Because it might be that we still can use it, but actually we're going to, the relevance isn't as, you know, we just question, all it means is we're more critical of it, that's all, which isn't a bad thing.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
And then in terms of data and information, we've got the different stages of the process. We've already talked about the initiation stage and the PID, the project initiation document, and Claire was kind enough to share some information on that. So we're getting things going on that one in terms of the information and what we're sharing. The planning, this was where the schedule, the Gantt chart, the governance processes, which is, I think, huge across all areas of the statute in law for HS2 that's come down as well. And then we're agreeing in terms of how frequently we're communicating as well. And again, from HS2, that's very well specified, I think, in terms of what's happening and when, and sort of it's all, it seems in all the, in terms of consultations as well, everything's very clearly defined, isn't it? So there's sort of, that reduces risk, doesn't it? Because you're working to protocol. So because of that, you're not personally taking risk on it. And this is just, so this is just looking at the data and information at each of these stages. Then we've got the sort of when it's actually happening. So we're going to be updating our schedules then. We're going to be looking at sort of where we are, the level of risk then, and the sort of reporting through the board that we're doing, and hopefully having a sign-off process when it's felt like the criteria met in terms of it being handed over. And then it becomes sort of we've got the completion stage where we're hopefully reflecting on what happened, what worked well, what didn't. We are making sure we've met everything and doing a post-implementation review, which can then inform future projects, and actually then it moves into business as usual. So at this stage we've got different information which is developed from initially from data in many ways that's used here. So we've got the different documents and things in terms of the information that's shared at each case. So the initial bits, then we've got initially the project plan is a project initiation document, potentially a project charter. We've got a set of ground rules that are agreed by the team involved. We've put a business case before we've even done any of that to get it signed off. Then on an ongoing basis, we're looking at the project plan, we're looking at risks, we're continually updating those. Then actually, if we're in a project of a certain type, we're going to have a project where we're overseeing where we're at, but we're also doing change control if we're actually deviating from what's been agreed and signed off. And then finally, we've got a project report potentially at the end, depending on our reporting cycle. And we've got different elements here that you'd have in a business case, but I just want to, just in terms of the words and what we're actually asking for this, because it feels like quite a heavy one to really end on with this. We are looking, just 1 second, get the right page of your support sheet out. Okay. Right, sorry. What we're doing on this, we're looking at data and information in a project environment. So we're looking at the characteristics of data and information, but we've also been looking at how they fit into the project planning cycle. And we're looking, sorry, I'll get myself a bit mixed up here. Let me, what I'd like to do is just open the assessment sheet so I can sort of show you where we're at with this as well, because I think it would be helpful to share that. Let me just sorry. Right. I have to go to Moodle to download it, sorry. Conscious so I'm not showing the right screen, I don't think, so just let me share that and then we'll sort of help to bring it all together with doing this. Okay, this is on this module that we're doing at the moment, so I've put it in the right order as well. So it's managing projects, because I just feel with this whole subject there's so much that we can talk about, and it's just making sure that you're covering the right things in here. Just for yeah, okay. So on the second task, which we're just concluding now, we've started off by looking at the initial stage of the project, and we've got a lot that we can say that according to the type of project that you're on. By that point, we've got this, so it's all been approved, but this is now about how we're going to kick it off, how we're agreeing KPIs, the purpose, the objectives. Then we've talked about collaboration with stakeholders, and you're going to use some of the techniques you use in the stakeholder engagement module last. We were also talking here, okay, this is it's sort of back to front. So we've got managing data and information. So we're using here, what have we collected, what's useful in terms of sort of managing. So what do you need to know? So this could be quite early on or on an ongoing basis. So can anyone give me some examples of what, as your project is going along, what information and data are you going to be capturing?
Productivity rates.
Okay, fantastic. And have you got measures that you'd be looking at along the way to see how they compared with what you were expecting?
Not for on-site activities. I have for the works I'm doing, but that's just an internal tracker.
Okay, so that would just sort of give us a feel for how things are progressing then in some ways, wouldn't it, in terms of what, yeah, a sort of almost we can start a benchmark by understanding that.
Yeah.
So that would be really helpful. Anything else that you're sort of managing through your projects in terms of data and information? Any other examples that people have got that they're
as built information?
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. So that's another one. So what I want here is just, it isn't about measuring the success of the project. It's about along the way, what we're going to pick up. So we know the difference between data and information. We know that there is secondary and there's primary data as well. So actually, we may be paying to collect some data along the way. And actually, in the when Chloe was talking about HS2, it's all informed by data and information, isn't it? In terms of what decisions, how you're going to do certain things, how you're going to offset things. So it's a continual loop there in terms of collecting it to inform your strategy. So certain ones, it might be more captured and that's what you're going to use. Other ones, it's going to be more of an evolution. And then you're going to have to sort of adapt potentially, or bear it in mind as certain decisions are made. But this is just about really being, I don't know, sort of like really conscious that things just aren't accepted at face value, that when you're presented with certain opinions and things, really, how representative is that of what actually people are feeling or thinking, or is it just one person, you know? So it's sort of, it's questioning and with the right intention. So that's why we need to be looking at how we're doing it along the project and in the project environment. And then the final bit for this is, so we've done this a bit back to front, is the risks. So actually, the data and information would inform the risks, wouldn't it? Does that make sense? Because yeah, we'd find out from that. It could do anyway, because we could find the scale of a problem, or actually if it's unlikely to happen if they're linked together. Sort of feel the last one I've messed up on a little bit, so sorry about that. It's sort of what I'm trying to do is trying to get it to connect so it makes sense in terms of actually what we're trying to achieve. And this second question that we've done is about this good practice guide. So it's all about from the starting point to as we're going along what data and information we need, and then actually how we're going to deal with any risks that come along. So you sort of almost from here, you're taking it from good practice for your particular project, what they should be doing. Have you got enough on this to go at, do you think, for the first two tasks?
There's only one way to find out.
Ah, that's very good. There is, and I tell you what, you've got a lot of fact sheets. I know, if in doubt, look at a fact sheet. It's we have done a lot, but it's just light touch, isn't it? It's like, you know, a couple hundred words here, a couple hundred words there, but we've gone through. So first one, business as usual versus projects, and then we're looking at, in terms of projects, we've got the four categories, hadn't we, from sort of from the transformational through to the sort of incremental through to the one that are sort of coming from things that we weren't expecting. Legal, organisational and ethical. I think there was loads to be said on that. I think we've got quite a few options. The initiation process, as we've talked about, that should be sort of getting things up and running. And I think you've all got fairly standardised processes for that, but it depends on the scope of the project. Collaboratively, really should be, it depends on who you're trying to work with and actually how frequently, and sort of really trying to get people on the same page. Data and information we've just talked about in terms of what do we need as we go along to inform and to make sure that we're making the right decisions and to have a feedback loop, if you like. And then we can, well, we didn't conclude because we did it last, but we're looking at, you know, what risks are we going to accept, what risks do we need to mitigate, how do we quantify them, and we've got a simple table that we'd use for that, and then colour code it ideally as well. So On Moodle, there's just so many things like risk assessments if you've never done that before. There's things on managing projects, there's the agile we're going to come on to next time. We've got the RAG reporting model is that sort of colour coding for risk assessments. We've got things on Gantt charts. There is a lot of additional information which you can just reference as per, I think it was my third slide, because it's all from Management Direct. And then there's there's just loads, and there should be groups. There's just a whole thing on fact sheets. I feel it's a lot, but it's wide and thin, if that makes sense, because there's a lot, but not necessarily in a huge amount of depth. Does that make sense? It's sort of a real light touch overview of the project.